Okay, welcome everybody. Let me introduce myself and the panel. I am Alistair Cole. I'm the head of our Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, and I must extend my my thanks really to the conference organisers, particularly to Kenneth, who's done a wonderful job in bringing together this this very impressive set of panels and speakers over days. This particular panel is of especial interest to me, not least because the colleague on my right here, Emilie Tran, has been working away on this for a long time now, Emilie, and we have been having conversations about this. I remember one in particular at a restaurant when we were talking about some of the methodological issues, I guess, in your fascinating project. Let me just say a word really about the collaboration of three of the four members of the panel in a particular project. And it's a particular project about Chinese Twitter. And it's been very much based in Aarhus University in Denmark. And of course, Professor Mette Duno is a founding member of the China-Europe Research Platform on Chinese migration to and beyond Europe. And she's also very much really the driving force, I think it's fair to say, between this Chinese Twitter diplomacy project. But it's very much, the project's very much associated also with the two other panel members in our proceedings today. So in a sense, we have four papers. Time is pressing on. I would say that we probably have 15 minutes each, but then I am the chair, so I would say that, wouldn't I? It's quite possible it might spill over. Let's hope everybody keeps to good time, of course. But anyway, we'll follow the order, I think, on the program. So we start off with Mette Duno. I hope I've pronounced your name right, Mette. Probably I haven't, but apologies for that. But Mette is an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark, where she does research very much on global China. And the particular interest, I think, and along with Emilie as well, really, is studying China as a diaspora state. Along with Chinese migration to Europe and PRC diplomacy. And in a sense, the panel is very much centered around this particular project on Twitter diplomacy. So I suggest that I don't introduce you anymore, but that we spill over straight away for the first of our presentations. And so this is Mette Duno from Aarhus University, Making Cold War Public Diplomacy, China's Twitter Diplomacy During the Pandemic.
Thank you very much. Should I go ahead and share my slides now?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Would this seem to be working at your end?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you a lot for the chair as introduction, and thank you to all the people behind this great event for organizing such a wonderful conference and getting all the technical sides in order so that we can also participate from afar. I'm very impressed. So today I'm joining you from Aarhus, Denmark, and it is a great privilege for me to be able to present a paper to you that is still in progress, but day by day becoming, I think, more relevant as China's foreign relations policies and its diplomacy are noticeably changing with China's new geopolitical role in the world. And as the chair just mentioned, the paper is part of a larger research project, also encompassing the following two papers. So I'm looking forward to my panelists' contributions. Just Wednesday this week, General Secretary and President Xi Jinping, he stated in a video address to APEC leaders in a bid to join the Asia-Pacific trade bloc that, and I quote him now, "We should be forward-looking, move ahead and reject practices of discrimination and exclusions of others," he said. And he followed on, attempts to draw ideological lines or form small circles on geopolitical grounds are bound to fail. The Asia-Pacific region cannot and should not relapse into the confrontation and division of the Cold War era, unquote. So Xi Jinping was not mentioning the US in his talk, but was clearly making a reference to the Biden administration and its strategy in the Pacific and the narrative of the US about Cold War rivalry with China. And rejecting the Cold War China has in 2019 and 2020 taken quite a lot of tit-for-tat actions to confront the US in almost every realm and everywhere in the world, including expelling American journalists, banning reporting from Hong Kong and Macau, sanctioning high-level American officials, and so on. Chinese diplomats have, just like Xi did on Wednesday, clearly reacted on the US Cold War framing. Since it started under President Bush, and Chinese diplomats have started using Twitter more widely to counteract these Cold War accusations. So my paper today is exploring these three matters and how Chinese diplomats since late 2019 have communicated with the world in new ways by using the social media platform Twitter, and to analyze what the Chinese diplomats have been tweeting about in primarily English to enable me to assess if Chinese diplomats are turning into aggressive wolf warriors, as it has been very often portrayed in Western media. So I'm asking the questions: how did Chinese diplomats using English employ Twitter as a fairly new communication channel during the pandemic? What were the topics of China's Twitter diplomacy as reflected in the content of tweets published during the year of the outbreak of the pandemic, that is 2020? And Chinese diplomats also turning into, are they really turning into wolf warriors, all of them, and thereby instigating a Cold War 2.0? And let me begin with setting the context in which China's Twitter diplomacy emerged. In July last year, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered the Trump administration's fourth speech on China at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. And in this speech, he applied Cold War terminology, such as you may read on the slide. We, and I quote, "we must all engage and empower the Chinese people, a dynamic and freedom-loving people who are completely distinct from the Chinese Communist Party," he said. And this sounds as an echo to US efforts during the Cold War to really inspire and foster Soviet citizens to internal rebellion. And he also expressed that changing the CCP's behavior cannot be the mission of the Chinese people alone. Free nations have to work to defend freedom. And he went on to say that he had faith in the United States being successfully able to force a change in Beijing's behavior, because it had done so before with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So although the Biden administration has not used explicit Cold War rhetoric in the same way, it has continued many of Trump's get tough policies, increased public criticism of China's human rights violations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and countered Chinese military exercises in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. Casting the rivalry as a battle between democracies and autocracies, the Biden administration has placed a strong emphasis on democratic values and re-engaged like-minded allies to impose costs for China when it challenges the US values and interests. The Cold War framing has been heavily criticized by Chinese diplomats as a zero-sum mindset and ideological prejudice. And let me give you two examples of that now. The first is coming from the Chinese diplomat Liu Xiaoming, former outspoken Chinese ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming. He rejected on Twitter that China is exchanging the role of the former Soviet Union is a new Cold War development. And he said, "We must stay on high alert," and this is on Twitter, alert, and say no to these remarks. We should make it clear to the trumpeters of such fallacy that China is not the former Soviet Union, that the Cold War has ended for good, and that peace and development are the theme of our time and the common goal of China and the UK. And accusations made against China, unquote. So this was in May 2020. Accusations made like this against China on the grounds of violating human rights in Xinjiang, to, among other reasons, underpin the rhetoric of a Chinese authoritarian and dehumanizing regime, have also brought forward aggressive replies from Chinese diplomats. One such as the Chinese ambassador to France, Lu Shaiye. And he is also one of the outspoken Chinese ambassadors who has been using Twitter, among other media platforms, to condemn Western sanctions against China, calling reports of human rights abuses against Uyghurs in Xinjiang as lies and disinformation. He has also claimed that older people were left to die in France during early 2020, which made Paris summon him several times to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to explain his, what in French was called insults and threats made on Twitter and other media. It has earned him the title of being one of China's diplomat wolf warriors in Western media. But as he says himself on this slide, he is honored to be awarded the title. We are fighters who stand in front of the motherland and fight for her, and we want to stand in the way of mad dogs that attack China, unquote. So another Chinese diplomat who is also proud of being called a wolf warrior is the spokesperson of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Zhao Lijian. He went as far on his official Twitter account to spread conspiracy theories and post fabricated pictures to underline Western encroachment on China. And in March 2020, Zhao Lijian, he promoted the conspiracy theory that the United States military could have brought the novel coronavirus to China, and as such, it did not originate in the city of Wuhan. On December 1st, 2020, he posted on Twitter a fabricated picture with the headline, and you can see it here on your right, "Shocked by murder of Afghan civilians and prisoners by Australian soldiers." And he wrote, we on Twitter, it was just under the picture, "We strongly condemn such acts and call for holding them accountable," unquote. So the fake image shows a grinning Australian soldier holding a bloody knife to the throat of an Afghan child who is clutching a lamb. And of course, the Australian Prime Minister, he responded that this was really shocking and shameful that an official Chinese government account had disseminated a manipulated image and making these and had, it came to have, severe implications for the relationship between China and Australia. So these examples illustrate how this increasing hostility between the US, including its allies, and China have aggravated hostile diplomatic communication on Twitter, being entirely open to the general public of the world. And this overlap of Chinese diplomats posting fabricated pictures, spreading conspiracy theories, and in general responding by blaming the US and the UK and allies whenever these nations criticized, discredited, or interfered in China's internal affairs as perceived by China, made Chinese diplomats become susceptible to the framing of being a bunch of aggressive wolf warriors. In other words, I think that Western media and political elites communicated perceptions of Chinese diplomats being rogue diplomats, breaking diplomatic protocols, thus confirming that the PRC was really turning into an international threat and a revisionist power. However, we have analyzed 40,000 Chinese diplomatic tweets and retweets in English for 16 months, yielding another picture of Chinese diplomacy in general during the year of the pandemic. And our empirical data consists of Twitter API that we downloaded, and it's all English tweets from 27 Chinese diplomats' accounts or handles, if you want, from November 2019 to February 28 this year. And diplomats were both based in China, Europe, and the US, as well as the State Council's Information Office in Beijing. And these are the handles that we downloaded messages from. So just give you a small impression. And due to time constraints, I know you don't have the time, but you can see it are those major diplomatic accounts that we have included here. And then in addition, we have also checked activity in non-English speaking tweets, such as those coming from the ambassadors of France and Germany, Italy. So what we have found out is that you see that the most active handles in terms of retweets here, original tweets and retweets comes later. These 10 handles alone, they make up 86% of all original tweets in the data set. So that's a whole lot. The next slide, you will see that the top 5 most active accounts when it comes to retweeting There are 5 handles that make up 78% of all retweets in the dataset. And some account holders seem to be retweeting all day long, actually. In other words, we are talking about just a few Chinese diplomats who are active on Twitter, and far from everyone. If we're looking at the temporal aspect, we are here having a blue line. We're indicating the tweets that are coming from the diplomats' accounts during the period from November 2019 until 21 February, at the end of February. It's a blue line. Whereas the yellow line, that are the media tweets coming from Chinese official media. And you can see that actually the diplomatic tweets are not increasing, except for a few exceptions, very much during 2020 compared to the late 2019. So we can also try to find out how the communication network is on Twitter. And another feature of Chinese diplomatic Twitter usage is that with a few exceptions, the reply function is not often used, but hashtags and mentions to other Chinese accounts and Chinese hashtags predominate. This leads us to conclude that Chinese public diplomacy on Twitter during this period has primarily been engaged with the creation of a self-referencing network that does not include very much interaction with the Twitter followers and readers of the world. And this leads us to the next question about topics of concern in our 40,000 tweets dataset. And let's just go quickly on to the dataset on topics. Now we use topic modeling, and topic models are a suite of algorithms whose aim is to discover the hidden thematic structure in large archives of documents. You could say that topic modeling algorithms are statistical methods analyzing words of the text to discover the themes that run through them, how the themes are connected to each other, and how they change over time. It's not only counting the most prevalent words and conclude that this is the most prevalent theme, but it finds hidden thematic structures. In other words, observed variables are the words of documents. The hidden variables are the topic structure. And the topic model that we have applied is called L. Davis. And you can see how it looks when it comes out. This is the topic model of diplomatic tweets from Chinese diplomats, and displaying the LDA topic models for diplomats. Both were specified with K being 12, that is that to find 12 topics in diplomatic tweets. To the left, we see each topic mapped out in 2 dimensions. The size and the number are relative to how dominant the topic is. And topic 1 is the biggest topic, while topic 12 is the smallest. What does all of this mean? It simply means that, as expected, the most dominant topics by Chinese diplomats in this period were made up of the topics on China-US relations and the global fight against COVID-19. However, we also identified a large topic of concern being the strong bond between the CPC and the Chinese people, pointing to the situation of Chinese diplomacy being a function, first and foremost, of domestic affairs. Topic 4 and 5 are well-known topics in Chinese public diplomacy, but they were also rehearsed during this period to demonstrate China's continued openness and international cooperation in foreign affairs. So concluding based on this, who are then the wolf warriors actually? And it is only a handful of Chinese diplomats who were often aggressive in their rhetoric on Twitter and only when discussing specific topics. Aside from Zhao Lijian and Hua Chunyin, Lu Shuaiye and Liu Xiaoming can all be categorized as wolf warriors, standing up by making re-accusations against the US and its allies, or rectifying accusations related to China's internal affairs. Zhao Lijian and Hua Chunyin, being official spokespersons of the MFA, apparently are the primary diplomats allowed to set this tone of voice directly coming from Beijing. And then let me just quickly conclude that Twitter is, by Chinese diplomats, increasingly used as a means in public diplomacy, but active diplomats are still limited in numbers. Tweets are used as a one-way communication tools, and beside some exceptions, only few enter into dialogue with their followers. A Chinese diplomatic communication network is sustained together with Chinese official media on Twitter. Nevertheless, Chinese diplomats on Twitter have contributed to a more offensive and aggressive rhetoric to legitimate CCP's policies in relation to attack from the US on China as a geopolitical threat. However, Wolf Warrior diplomats are just accounting for a handful of diplomats, although very central ones. The large majority of diplomats is using Twitter for distributing Chinese state propaganda, including the new ambassadors in the US and the UK. So in this perspective, the Chinese diplomats who are more aggressive seem to be primarily appealing to the Chinese domestic audience, as their tweets are repeated in Chinese on Weibo and WeChat, making these diplomats appear more as sheep in wolves' clothing, so to say. The Chinese diplomatic warriors hardly qualify as any Cold War 2.0 soldiers, but their rhetoric and reactions reflect an authoritarian superpower in the making, trying to, I think, recalibrate its position in the world by having to communicate more inwards than outwards. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll pass on straight away, I think, to the second speaker. That's the norm, isn't it? I mean, we want to be sure that we've got enough time to discuss all of these 4 papers, but we'll pass on to the next speaker who she needs no introduction to me, but she might need some introduction to the wider world. So Emilie Tran is an assistant professor in our department, and she's the program director of our European Studies strand. Emilie's particularly known for bridging, in a sense, interests of Asia and Europe. And I think it's fair to say that your expertise, it's as much in Asia as in Europe, and you have a particular bridging function. I mean, clearly, the French dimension, and you'll be talking about that today, is clearly, in a sense, your real expertise, but you have a more general sort of expertise between China and Europe. I mean, your work on infrastructure projects and so on. These are all important and influential. I'm not going to say too much more about you because we haven't got time, but clearly it's great to have you here, and you will be presenting a paper with the intriguing title of "For They Have Sown the Wind and They Shall Reap the Whirlwind, China's Twiplomacy and Its Repercussion in France."
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alistair. I'd like to start with thanking the conference organizers and Professor Kenneth Poltan, as well as Professor Cherry and George. It's really a wonderful conference that you have put up, and thank you all the helpers, and I see many of them, for your hard work in the past days. So let me start without further ado. So as our chair has said, this is a collaborative research project, transnational research project led by Professor Mette Tuno, whom you have just heard now. And this is the second installment of our big project. So we started in 2000 with a Chinese Twitter, and then we follow up with another bigger fund on the China's Twitter diplomacy, content, and impact. In both cases, the principal investigator is Mette, and I'm very delighted and honored to be one of the co-investigators. So this is a bit daunting a slide, but I tried my best to sum to you, to present to you the literature on public diplomacy, especially public diplomacy on social media. And we shall start with 2006, with the launch of the Twitter app, basically. And as soon as the Twitter started, we can see, so you can see in a black font here, the literature on digital diplomacy in general, and then everything in red is related to the development of social media as well as Twiplomacy in China. So you can see that the literature is rather large in general when it comes to digital platforms and diplomacy, and scholars have discussed tremendously whether these social media allow better and more engagements, whether it was only one-way forms of communication, or rather it was one way for the states to assert, reshape their national identities overseas and their national narratives. We have also a few Western scholars who have explored Chinese Twitter diplomacy, starting with Manner lately in 2021, as well as Huang and Arifon, who are based in France, and Huang and Wang, and I'll come back to them later on, with Wang being based in the United States. So you see that Twitter was launched in 2006, and in 2009 already the Chinese government said that mass diplomacy would be very important, and the Chinese government set up a mass diplomacy division in order to develop its public diplomacy office. And this is something maybe we need to remind the audience here. Then we go to 2011, and it is the first time that the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry start up its Weibo account, so basically a Chinese Twitter Weibo account, followed then on by Xi Jinping, who says in August 2013, urging the diplomat to tell the China stories well. And basically, it's very interesting because I recall a dinner party not long ago when I was discussing with one of the panelists in the previous session, Vincent, and we're saying that first in our world, we have technologies, and then we have the media reporting about this, and then we have the scholars coming after and very late to build all the theories around this. But here in the case of China, what we see is that the state and the Chinese Communist Party are actually giving the impetus and telling very clearly the way forward and what to do. And they have actually theorized a lot, and I have summed up some of these authors, and you will see that soon in the next slide. So we move into later years, and we have March 2018 with the US-China trade war, and of course that's a great moment, and this would be the launching for China's Twitter diplomacy. Before the COVID-19. Then we have authors like Huang and Arifon, who will talk about a polyphony of Chinese digital diplomacy. That is one way to integrate not one discourse and narrative, but to have several discourses and narrative to give a sense that it is orchestrated and there are several voices speaking towards the same objective. We have also a number of Chinese scholars who have documented how Chinese diplomacy should adapt and learn from all this big literature that preceded them. And they have taken into account this previous literature to further make recommendations as to how to develop a Twitter diplomacy. So when we discuss about China's digital public diplomacy, there are many studies already preceding our own work, and I present them here in order to tell you better where we situate ourselves within this emerging field. So basically, China has conceptualized the digitalization of its public diplomacy as early as 2012, and throughout the year 2010s, China has spoken about the strength or the moderation of foreign strategy that depends on how diplomacy serves internal affairs and consolidate the CPC leadership. So it was already written that the use of the digital diplomacy was really to serve the party state interest. It is also said that the public diplomacy is an extension of the domestic propaganda in order to harvest flowers and applauses overseas. It is also said that this digitalization would be serving the mass mobilization campaigns, not only in China, but also outside China. So basically, public diplomacy for China is viewed as an external propaganda that framed the public diplomacy and China's discourse in order to combine at the same time mass media driven and political campaign overseas. And we have several authors, and you can see all of them listed on your right-hand side. In this emerging literature, two articles would be very important for us in order to tell you better where we situate ourselves. The first one dates back to 2019 from Huang and Wang. And it's about telling China stories, building a network to tell China stories well, Chinese diplomatic communication strategies on Twitter. And Huang and Wang have studied 13 Twitter accounts, and you can see them here on the right-hand side, mentioning that those accounts, they grew expansively, especially during September to December 2019. So it is a rather recent phenomenon, although, as I said to you in my previous slide, this theorization of a Chinese public diplomacy dates back to the early 2010s in China. So they say that China's effort to build a robust Twitter network centers around its closest friends and then expands outward to include other partners. But they also mentioned the limitation of their study with language barriers, because some of those Twitter handles communicate in non-English, basically Japanese and Turkish in their case. And they recommend that in future studies, there would be more diplomatic accounts to be studied in order to draw a more global picture of China's Twitter communication. And I can say that this is what we have been doing in our own project. The second article I'd like to draw your attention to is another article from 2021, same scholars, Huang and Wang, and they basically have shown how China's digital public diplomacy is an instrument for the CPC to legitimize and popularize its ideology and enhance its credibility among domestic publics. And that's why they put forward this very interesting concept of domestic public diplomacy. That is, foreign policy actually serves a domestic audience. But at the same time, they are trying very hard, those Chinese diplomats, to make a global political advocacy and storytelling. And they also have shown, these two authors, how domestic factors have influenced China's digital public diplomacy. And at the same time, they have made two main recommendations. That is because this particular article was looking into the case study of the China-US trade war. And they made recommendation that other scholars should go and look into the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was precisely what we have done. And they have also recommended to expand the data set by analyzing the role of the media beyond only the accounts of the diplomats, and this is also, again, exactly what we have done in our study. So in my particular paper, you have heard about the introduction presented by Mete just now. My particular paper is another case study of China's public diplomacy in France during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it draws on the work of Huang and Wang in 2019 and 2029, leading me to ask these two questions. First of all, what did the Chinese diplomat do and say in those times? And I have studied 3 diplomatic accounts on Twitter from November 2019 to February 2021, but I have not stopped there. I have also gone beyond this date. I have also studied the website of the Chinese embassy, as well as the various declarations of His Excellency Lu Shaye, Ambassador of China to France. My second research question was, having explored the actions of the Chinese diplomats, how have been the reactions of the society, starting with the reactions of the media? And we have adopted a framing analysis of the French media, examining the process of meaning making and influence among the public. So our framing analysis consists of looking at how the media have identified the problem, how the media have assessed the problem, and what they say about the causes of the problems that they have found, and how the media have proposed the way forward. And I will finish with the repercussions on the impact of these media reports. This is a slide about exactly my data set. So as Mete said previously, she has shown you the data set and mentioned that those Twitter accounts that our algorithms have explored were all in English. My Twitter accounts here, they are mostly in French, so they were not part yet of this algorithm processing, and I hope that we can find a way to do that. But this is what we have explored. So 3 Twitter accounts, Chinese embassy, in Paris, the Consulate General of China in Strasbourg, and the General Consulate of China in Lyon. And you can see on this table here that by very far, the most active account is the Chinese embassy in Paris that was opened in August 2019. And you can see that the other accounts were opened just a few months later, but much less active. When we look into the details of this tweet, so altogether, these three accounts from this period of November 2019 to February 2022, they have accumulated close to 8,000 tweets, and mostly in French. 95% original tweets. So that's very important, especially from the Chinese embassy. That's the one that creates the original tweets. Those tweets, they talk about several topics, as you can see here. So the first topic, because of the context, was specifically related to the COVID. And Xinjiang was also very high in the news at that time, and a great concern for Europeans, as well as Hong Kong to a lesser extent. So those are how I have presented my data set. Now, let us focus on the most active diplomat on this Twitter account, and this is His Excellency Lu Shaye. You can see from his bio here that he's a well-seasoned diplomat. And just before coming to France, he was posted in Canada. And the fact that he was moved from Canada to France was then commented as a show that for China, the relation with France was an important relations, and they appreciated that Beijing appreciated how Mr. Lu handled Huawei's affair and the hostages diplomacy then. So before he arrived in France, it was already known, and it was a matter of concern, that Mr. Lu was one of the very active, proactive Wolf Warrior diplomats. These two slides show you basically the timeline, and there were many moments of China's public diplomacy fallout in France, starting as early as March 2020, and up to March 2021. So March 2020, when the outbreak of the COVID-19 happened in Europe, and China was deploying its health diplomacy, and Mr. Lu Shaye was on Twitter very active, also very active in interviews with the French media and also on French TV. I must say that he speaks a beautiful French, and he can handle very tough questions in French directly on the media. Then we have December 2022, when a group of French MPs, senators, announced that they would visit Taiwan. That led to a string of tweets from Mr. Lu Shaye and the Chinese embassy condemning this visit. And then you have a French scholar, Dr. Antoine Bondaz, who would say, why would the Chinese criticize this move of MPs? And that would have been the first fallout, with Mr. Lu Shaye being summoned by the French minister for his non-diplomatic languages. And then we can see that there is a kind of increase in the wording, and that's very interesting, because from this type of intimidation and threats, the Chinese diplomat, Mr. Lu, uses insults like a small thug, like a mad dog, to characterize people who criticize China. And that would lead Mr. Lu to be summoned a second time by the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. Not only the Chinese embassy is very active on Twitter, but also on its official embassy website, there are long letters and texts that justifies the position of China. And what is interesting is the vocabulary that they use. Basically, this vocabulary has nothing to do with a diplomatic language. So that is in itself, all those letters from the Chinese website are very interesting to elaborate on. But we don't have time for that. And I want you now to move with me to the research question number 2, that is about the news and how the media have analyzed what was happening in the Chinese public diplomacy. And we have done this framing analysis and analyzed a few themes that have come up in the news, such as the relationship between China, Canada, China, Australia, China, France, and China, Europe. And basically those news are from the French news, mostly from Le Figaro, rather leaning on the on the right, not far right. And on the left-hand side, center left, is Le Monde. So we have conducted this analysis, basically looking at the themes that were discussed and of concerns to the media. And the French media, they identified the Chinese public diplomacy as a worrying change. And they have noticed also the change of the diplomatic tone, and they were alerted by also this change that reflected somehow the more authoritarian nature of the regime, even overseas. And they commented on the fact that it has not been that aggressive since Mao's time, and that China wanted to establish an image of itself being victorious against the crisis of the pandemic, but also economic crisis and economic crisis. So the French media identified these causes to explain why China was acting this way. And they are political causes, economical causes, international context, and also a more contextual factor that is the COVID-19 factor. So the French media emphasized on nationalism, the fact that China is trying to portray itself as a world leader, the fact that China is also suffering very much from the economical downturn caused by the COVID-19, and at the same time, China is trying to continue to lead ambitious projects along the BRI. Internationally, there is this shifting of international context and the shifting of world order that compelled China possibly to be more aggressive. And of course, this COVID-19 narrative, first from denial to creating a narrative of China's superiority with the deployment of its health diplomacy. The French media have also not only discussed the causes, but tried to put a judgment and propose ways forward to overcome this warfare diplomacy. And for these topics, they have proposed several ways forward. And the main way forward, we can sum it up by, the collaboration of democracies against China. And then those will be my last two slides. Thank you, Chair. These discourses in the French media have also compelled another chain reaction inside the think tanks in France. And this is one particular study issued in September 2021, talking about the Chinese operations of influence in France. And the subtitle here is a Machiavellian moment. And you see how this vocabulary shows the state of mind of the French think tank network. But not only the think tank are concerned, this is the same month, the French Senate have produced this other report about the influence of China and basically authoritarian countries like China in the French academia and their impact. So you can see also the reaction from the public. So to conclude, and that is explains my title here, because China created somehow all this activism on Twitter, and the reaction have been, one can say, rather counterproductive. So my paper tried to characterize what is China's public diplomacy and the global picture of China's public diplomacy, from self-promotion on the international stage, from self-advocacy by telling China's story, to basically warfare diplomacy that features first intimidation, undermining, discrediting enemies, adversaries, leading even to personal insults. This has led to the media to propose and to portray negative discourses of China's behavior, and it has increased awareness and growing concerns from the public opinion, think tanks, and governments. And this is well reflected in all the opinion poll surveys in France and throughout Europe. That sentiment towards China was really less favorable since 2020. So this counterproductivity basically leads us to question really what is the purpose of this public diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Emilie. And there's many very interesting questions from your presentation, but I think we'll just have to push on because time is short. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to for our next paper giver, Tseng. That's the right pronunciation, I believe. So thank you very much, Eugene. Eugene is a professor at the Taiwan Studies at the University of Tübingen, and has been, again, very active in this network and works very much on questions of migration, global mobility, gender, citizenship studies, and Asian politics. And without further ado, perhaps I would invite you to share your screen. You have, so the floor is over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Alistair, for your nice introduction. And also I would like to thank the organizer to give us such a nice platform to share our research. So I'm so lucky to have such two great presenters ahead of me who have already set out the overarching framework of this research. So I'll just go directly into my presentation. So build on the gathered Twitter data and analysis that have been presented, this paper explores further into include the analysis on Twitter accounts of two Chinese officials in Germany and the analysis on German media regarding China's Twiplomacy to examine the repercussions of China's aggressive public diplomacy in German media discourse. It seeks to reveal whether Twitter diplomacy in Germany is different from that in other places in English-speaking world in terms of its patterns, its topics and content, and also its tones. In addition, by including the ways in which China's COVID responses is perceived in German media, it shows in more detail how China, not only its diplomacy, but also China, is perceived in Germany during the pandemic. So to contextualize the research, as Emilie presented, Twitter diplomacy is not a new attempt. Also, it has become much more visible since the emergence of the wolf warriors. But it has started much earlier, right after Xi's urge to tell China's story well. Yet, the Twitter diplomacy back then was quite different from what we see today. And according to this paper Emilie also cited, it says that the previous China media diplomacy is characterized by the timid polyphonic features, which included the various tones to create a tolerant, democratic, and responsible online image of rising global power. Well, the reason why it has changed so dramatically cannot be fully accounted today, but what I seek to do and to elucidate it, what differs and what remains in China's Twitter diplomacy. So let me go into the, so the usage of Twitter is sort of mediated public diplomacy that is organized efforts to bring influence to a target country. And the mediated public diplomacy is to organize efforts to doing so using communication, including internet. And the public diplomacy in the digital age is characterized by its interconnectivity, connectivity, and individual participation. And it is exchange-based. They require the interactivity and the individual participation, which offers reciprocal interactions. So therefore, by identifying the main actors who tweet and who got retweeted the most, and the themes that are mentioned the most, this research mapped out the Twitter network created by active account users and explores what are the messages intended to be communicated. So I used a mixed method approach, including manual coding, computer-assisted content analysis, and network analysis, and the discourse analysis. These papers focus first the use of Twitter of 2 Chinese officials in Germany. Second, it looks at articles on two mainstream German newspapers. And in 2020, in order to survey the ways in which Twitter diplomacy is discussed and evaluated in these media outlets. Third, this paper also looks at how China is perceived with regard to COVID-19, its origin and containment tactics in a wider range of German media, including Der Spiegel and the Bild. So the data set A was presented by Meta, which are the English tweets. So I will skip this part. Through the analysis, we have identified most dominant topics, which are, these 5 are the top 5. And then also one of the preliminary findings is that not all the Chinese diplomats are wolf warriors, as mentioned by Mette. So instead, only a very small portion of the diplomats tweets aggressively. Then how about the rest of the diplomats? In what sense do they get involved in China's Twiplomacy? And how do they stay in line with China's official foreign policy agenda? So I use the case of 2 German diplomats to answer these questions. One is Embassy of PRC in Germany, the Ambassador Wu Ken, and the second is the Consulate General of PRC in Hamburg, Du Xiaohui. And for these 2 accounts, they amount to 1,994 tweets, including originals, retweets, and the replies. And among these tweets, the mostly mentioned topics are, of course, due to the the COVID-related topics. And then the second is Deutschland, Germany, of course. And then the third most prominent topic is Xinjiang, and then USA and the China-EU relations. So I will quickly present how these hot topics were appeared and presented in their Twitter accounts. So I identified this string of tweets, which is called Hand in Hand gegen Corona, Hand in Hand against Corona. And under this slogan, the account tweets lots of the touching small stories, like these female surgeons who gave up her marriage to contribute to stay in Germany to help the patients, or like about how much materials and the resources the Chinese government exported. Then on the topic Xinjiang, it kind of projects a very harmonious, peaceful images like this video, Uyghur people dancing happily for the ethnic festival on the square. And then on this topic of the US, there are 2 main tones of regarding the topic of USA. One is that to accuse USA for smearing China, and the second is the Cold War. And as you can see clearly from the comics, it accuses of USA putting on the biased colored glass in looking at Xinjiang issue. And then this is even more straightforward. It accuses US to throw lies targeting at China. And in terms of the topic of Cold War, the both account kind of reject it fully and say the Cold War is only harmful to not only China and US, but to the whole world as well. Then the China, EU, Europe emphasize on the close ties between them. So the findings of these 2 accounts, first is that these diplomats in Germany are not aggressive as the wolf warriors. And the second is that, however, they are not aggressive, but they still follow the shared framing of this telling China story, and then to debunk fake news and the dirty lies about China. And what is interesting is that almost half of the tweets are retweets. And these are retweets from very specific resources, such as Renmin Ribao, the Deutsche version of the People's Daily, CGTN, etc., who are all state-owned media. So these kind of form a closed network that recite each other to project a specific narrative among them. Then the second data set is about how the German media sees China Twitter diplomacy. And we look at two newspapers, so Deutsche Zeitung, which is more center left, and the second one is more conservative. And we identified 14 articles in 2020. And for this part, I will quickly go to the findings due to the time strain. Wait. So, yeah. So the finding is that China's Twitter diplomacy is perceived very negatively in both newspapers. And these two newspapers perceived China in an almost identical way that the newspaper's own stance did not affect on the perception at all. And the Twiplomacy follows Beijing's agenda, and diplomats are seeking for recognition from the superior. And then the third finding is that being aggressive is actually a sign of stress and threat. It actually tries to deflect criticism from China's diplomatic failures in pandemic prevention and containment policies, which is the, as Emilie mentioned, it's public diplomacy serves for domestic purposes. So it is also a response to increasing international criticism on mishandling of virus reporting and the cooperation under the WHO's early warning framework. So they resort to a Chinese version of origin of the virus, tell a China story to shake off the blame and to defend the international reputation of China. So to sum up, the framing of these newspapers on China is to see it as a threat. Now, if we go beyond the diplomacy, the way in which China is perceived also resonates this conclusion. So this is the cover of Der Spiegel, and it depicts a man in a red protective suit and a breathing mask with the title, which reads "Coronavirus Made in China" on the cover page issued in February 2020. So the cover exemplifies what some might call xenophobia, a combination of racism and bio-orientalism, to borrow Cohn's term. So the fear of the virus coming from the outside, especially China, is intervened with the feeling commonly shared by people within the territory of a political entity that justifies a sense of community. The corollary of such transition materialized the anti-Asian sentiments that could be observed in Germany. So here I propose the concept of epidemiological nationalism that produces political narratives and political measures based on the racial and the national differences, using and abusing the solidarity discourse to protect a sanitary, uninfected, and healthy collective of us. Such social imagination has rendered global health to be necessarily some sort of being nationalist. In practice, it can be seen as a racialization of COVID-19 and the exclusion of racial or national others. So that's why I titled my presentations of Other in China. Okay, thank you very much.
The final paper, and then we must leave 15-20 minutes for discussion, not least because I have at least 6 questions. We're now moving on to our final paper, Chinese Discourse Against United States in the WTO Arena. And so we'll ask on you, Mariano Mosquera from the Catholic University of Cordoba. I was looking actually to try and present you more fully, and it's a fascinating, you've got a fascinating background actually, and I would really like to spend the time to present you properly. However, we're pushing on in time, so if I may, we'll just move over to your presentation, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm gonna share my slides here. I think it's okay, right?
Yeah, we've got it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the presentation. Well, the title of my presentation, I changed a little. I put an analysis of Chinese discourse in the World Trade Organization arena. It's a paper that is already published, but it's in Spanish, so I'm going to translate all the findings about my paper. Well, a little about me. I'm director at Center for Belt and Road Studies at Catholic University of Cordoba in Argentina. This is it's important to have more centers related to Chinese studies in Latin American countries because, of course, the influence and the diplomacy related to China is really important in Latin America right now. Well, some basics basic information related to my research. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. The dispute settlement, this is what I'm going to study in this research, in this presentation. The dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization is the one that imposed the least restriction over China participation in the World Trade Organization. This is really important. And of course, in 2001, it was feared that China would collapse the dispute system, but it didn't happen, and China has strategical interventions in the World Trade Organization arena. Other basic information, the World Trade Organization dispute mechanism, of course, belongs to a normative system with legal vocabulary. This is important because my unit of analysis is going to be legal arguments. The World Trade Organization dispute mechanism is a dispute arena between countries, and disputes in the World Trade Organization mechanism have influence in other countries not directly related to the dispute. So it's a really interesting arena to try to understand how it works. Other basic information, China as a plaintiff or a complainant and defendant concentrate 5.5 of the historical activity of the World Trade Organization dispute mechanisms. Of course, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, but this is related what I said before, that in 2001 it was feared that China would collapse the dispute system, but it didn't happen. China has made 21 demands, 16 against the United States and 5 against the European Union. I call demands, I call plaintiff or complainant about China, but technical is a request for consultation, but it is the same form that a plaintiff. This is interesting too, because China's participation as third party took place mostly in disputes involving the United States and the European Union. That means that China is interested in trying to understand how it works, strategies related to United States and European Union. When China has participation and a third party, not directly involved in a conflict, and try to understand how it works, some strategies, China involved in disputes related to United States and European Union. Methodology about the paper, the unit of analysis, of course, is legal argument, and this is important, is the focus of how China demand. And China demand when consider that certain general measures of the United States or European Union were incompatible with the World Trade Organization normative system. This is the central focus of all Chinese demands to United States or European Union. So we have 4 categories of analysis. These 4 categories analysis are okay for all the legal arguments that we have in all demands of China. First at all, that the measure of the United States or European Union is poorly defined or has wrong definition of concepts. This is important, and one of the important conclusions is related to this first category. Other category of analysis is that the measure is well implemented due to technical error, discrimination in implementation against China, partially not proven, or normative contradiction. Another category of analysis is that the measure is not informed, and the last category is that the measure of United States or European Union is not proven. So, I analyzed in the paper a total of 233 legal arguments were in the framework of China claims to the United States and the European Union. This is all the arguments. We don't have more arguments in all the demands of China to United States or European Union. And some results, related to the categories, we have 6 legal arguments related to wrong definitions of the measures of in the measures of the United States or European Union, 140 wrong implementations of United States or European Union, not informed measures of European Union or United States, 44, and not proven in this last category, 43 legal arguments related to not proven measures of United States or European Union. And results, what we can find about this analysis of legal arguments. First of all, that there is a result related to particularity. This is very important because all Chinese arguments related to demands against United States or European Union are related to try to put in the focus the particularity of China or particularities of China. So all the wrong definitions that China says that measures of United States and European Union has in the general measures that they did against China, for example. So China put in the focus the wrong definition. China, with this, has the purpose, of course, of contrasting the particularity of the definition of its regime with the meaning of the pre-established definition, of course, related to the World Trade Organization history. That is that China trying to put in the focus that China has particularities that they are not related to the definition that United States or European Union use inside the framework of the World Trade Organization. So it's a dispute over specificity. Of course, China says the measures of United States and European Union are unproven, for example, with respect to the specificities or particularities of China. This is 30% of total arguments. So there's a lot. For example, when we analyze the wrong implementation, the argument related to wrong implementation of United States or European Union when China demands and say that United States or European Union had wrong implementation of their measures, maybe not a specific technical error or a normative contradiction, but this partially not proven, this 13% and discrimination to China are directly related to this, to dispute over specificity. So all the categories 2 and 3, measures wrong implemented and measures not informed by the defendant, refers to condition of no compliance with existing World Trade Organization law. So this is more legal conditions, and this is more similar to all the strategies in the all legal arguments of all countries in the World Trade Organization. But Category 1, measures wrong defined by the defendant, and Category 4, measure is not proven by the defendant, refer more to legal extra narrative, that is, references that are external to the legal discourse, and have a greater considerations to particularity and Chinese specificities. So this is important because Category 2 and 3 are more related to the common sense in the all demands of all countries in the World Trade Organization, but Category 1 and Category 4 is really different for China strategy in the World Trade Organization arena. Other result that is very clear in the China's demands when criticized United States or European Union, specifically related to the United States, they say that it's omission of evidence, that, for example, that the United States is not concerned with obtaining the best possible information to draw up its conclusion, but rather that what it does is a choice of facts, similar to a cherry picking that we call in academics. So related to this, Category 3 and 4, not informed measures plus measures not proven by the defendant, by United States or European Union, means that as the defendant did not disclose information, he did not call for the participation of the interest parties and did not bother to collect all the pertinent opinions. This is what China says about specifically United States, because this kind of abuse of authority, this kind of results is more related to United States than the European Union. And the last result that is important is China often mentions values more than legal technicalities. Even when citing legal norms, it prefers to focus on the general section that refer to value. This is important because this seems that to indicate a suggestion that the defendant is not interpreting the rule in good faith, that United States or European Union are not interpreting World Trade Organization rules in good faith. Bona fide is the principle in international law. So my final conclusion that is related to an important academic discussions since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. It was an academic discussion about if China is going to be rule maker or rule shaker in the World Trade Organization arena. And my conclusion after my analysis of 233 legal arguments is that China does not reflect an hegemonic vocation at the World Trade Organization arena with rule maker and only raise particularity associated with its case. It's more like a rule shaker function because they try to put in focus that the important is to respect particularities of China, specificities of China, but they don't try to make new rules in the World Trade Organization, of course, in the demands related to against United States and European Union. So that's all. Of course, it's a paper already published, but it's in Spanish. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting paper. And in a sense, this brings us to the the time when we can actually ask some questions. We've had an ongoing debate actually while we've all been speaking, and Metti's asked Metti's already answered a number of questions that have come up while you were speaking in particular, Emilie. I'd like to abuse my position as chair, but then you wouldn't expect me not to. However, if there are any questions that people would like to ask, either on the web, on Zoomland, or indeed in our room, if not, I'll have a quick overview, if I may. I'll try and be brief because we've taken a long time. Fascinating set of papers. Thank you very much for your dedication and work. I've got one question that's a bit about method, I suppose, and another that's a little bit about substance. And I'm particularly on the tweeting papers at the moment, but I will also come back with a comment on the on the WTO paper later. On the tweet paper, now you've clearly done a massive work here. It's deeply impressive, actually. The work you've already done on this, not least because it's genuinely collaborative. My methods question is not really a methods question. I mean, I think in a sense, the topic modeling that you introduced, Metti, was really extremely convincing. But I suppose in a way, it's a much simpler question than that. It's if we're shocked by a particular tweet, might be because that particular tweet will have an impact, you know, and we'll take the example of the Australian soldier, for example. And in a sense, your method, it's much more aggregative than that. I mean, in a sense, you give us an overview of the nature of the sort of overall results of the tweets that you've looked at, and in a sense they're very impressive. You know, you point out that most of this it's actually for domestic consumption in a way, and I mean I think, you know, you can also make that case. But is there a sense that the saliency of a particular tweet actually matters more really than the aggregate, if you like, of the tweets overall? So that's my sort of, it's a comment rather than a question. The question might be, then we had because in a sense there's a hard focus on tweets. But then there's also in Emilie's paper and in the other sorry, I can't. Anyway, in the other papers, there's the emphasis a little bit on going beyond the tweets and looking at media. You know, looking at the media analysis. So we had the French media, we had the German media, and that was fascinating in a way, in and of itself. But I suppose, you know, what's the linkage between the tweets and the media? That's not a nice question, but in a sense, it's one that I think I think that there's a very good linkage, obviously. But I think, you know, is it the sort of, you know, the tweets and in a sense, the comments on the tweets are a little bit different. And so that's really my question stroke comment. And I guess my question stroke comment for the last paper was, and again, I thought very interesting, actually, very interesting paper. And it's interesting that seeing China as a rule shaker rather than a rule maker. I think that's quite nice, actually. And I suppose it's a question that goes back about rules and constitutive rules of organizations when they're set up, and how players, if you like, react to I suppose you know, when those rules were made, and how strategies rationally adapt to some extent to those rules. So they were a couple of comments. We have a question here, so maybe I'll ask the question. And that's not my question, it's a question from the live. So I'll read out the question, and then we can take perhaps those two together. The question from Mosquera Saludin, just out of curiosity, I would like to ask how China's Twitter diplomacy and European media's portrayal of China as a counter-reaction has, in the last few years, affected China's diplomatic relations with France, Germany, and other studied European countries on an institutional governmental level. Okay, so that's an open question. So please, over to you, audience. No, not. Metti, first of all, of course. We'll take them in the order. Metti, Emilie, and we'll take them in the order. Eugene. So Metti first, maybe.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this question about methods, or rather implications of single cases of tweets. And what we are trying to do is to try to find a more general picture. And certainly one single case of a tweet has triggered immense problems in China's relations with, particularly, of course, the US, also Australia, France, and the UK. So it's true that we have these cases. The problem that we have faced is to try to find out if it's a general tendency that now that we are in a situation of geopolitical fights, we have the pandemic and we have China going on Twitter as a communication tool of diplomacy. Is it a general feature of Chinese diplomacy that all diplomats are becoming more rogue or wolf warrior types? And that's what we're trying to find out. Is China, in other words, moving away from the kind of diplomacy that has been a feature for almost 20 years, kind of trying to portray China as a partner following international rules, following international order, a partner that you can depend on, a serious partner. And we have this shift suddenly that has brought the media to say, look at it, China is really changing. And so what we have been trying to do is not to neglect the single cases and the impact of those, but try to tell this more broad story to see what is actually happening. And we're in terms of the topics taken up by the Chinese diplomats. And that has shown that some of the strands that we've seen that is a characteristic for Chinese diplomacy of taking up more propaganda-like, I'm putting that in citations here, topics is also still prevalent. And we just have a few cases of these wolf warriors, implying that perhaps it's more, it's not anything coincidental. It's just a few, but they're very centrally placed. And it's directed directly at the US and the EU. So we're trying to paint or trying to find out a more nuanced picture of new Chinese diplomacy.
Okay, thanks very much for that full answer. Emilie, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you very much, Alistair, for your questions. And I'd like to take the one on the saliency and then the one that is online. So how do we look at one particular tweet and what makes us look at one particular tweet? First of all, I think we have a vast amount of words accumulating all those tweets, and there are several levels of analysis that we can do. And the first one is certainly quantitative analysis, looking at the occurrences of each of the words, and that says something about what kind of stories China is trying to tell. Then we can look at the lexicon or champ lexical, as we say in French, and look into those words, and software such as Envivo can also help us do that. But when we look at particular tweets, and the saliency is really the number of the likes, the number of retweets that this particular tweet has generated, or the kind of reaction that this particular tweet have generated. So that's make the saliency. Now, about the online question about the impact on the institutional level, certainly what happened between China and France with regards to China's public diplomacy has changed the way France foreign ministry has looked at China, and has compelled actually France to enact new policies to try to stop the influence of China, not only in the French academia following this Senate report, but also in the Indo-Pacific region. So it has far-reaching consequences. Therefore, our study is just the beginning of a larger project to not only look at China's public diplomacy, but its repercussions. And we hope to be able to continue this with more funding.
Thank you. And I hope you get more funding. Eugene, do you want to get them in there?
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Maybe I'll focus on the relationship, the linkage between tweets and the media discourse that we look into. The reason why we include the German or media discourse is that we were considering how to evaluate the not the success, but the impact of the Twitter diplomacy. And we consider this is one of the way to see how the reactions and the repercussions in Germany, in German media outlet. Of course, this is not the only way to evaluate the impacts, right? As you mentioned, like one individual tweet might spur like a really big repercussions, but this is on a different level. But we think that by looking at the media discourse, it provides us a way to look at how this Twitter diplomacy is perceived in the receiving side, the audience side. Yeah,
okay, thanks. That's a very nice answer. I mean, we have, Daya.
Thank you. I have a question for the three presenters, not the fourth one, because that's a different topic altogether, about the irony in. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, the irony that the social platform that the Chinese diplomats are using so effectively, or not effectively, as a discussion, is banned in China. So, is there any kind of moral question there in terms of does that sort of limit their diplomatic effort because they're using a platform which is banned in their own country?
Mette, you want to answer? Thank you, Daya, for your question. Actually, Huang and Wang and other scholars have tried to link the usage of Weibo and Twitter. And normally diplomats are supposed to be active on both, but they are active in different manners. And this is how certain scholars have tried to say. So on Weibo, they communicate more in Chinese and they address a more Chinese audience in mainland China or in China. And then on Twitter, it really addresses people overseas. But people overseas include also a Chinese diaspora living overseas. Yes, but that's true. It's irony.
We had a question. Yes. 5 minutes. Okay. We've only got 5 minutes left. We did have a question to Mariano Mosquera, and just for the sake of the audience, this was a nice question. It was asking about the differences between Spain and Latin American countries, and I think the answer that was given was entirely appropriate. But maybe Mariano, you might explain, just say a little bit more about them, because you say Chinese commerce and investments in Latin America are really important, and they're much more so these permit better opinions in relation to China. I mean, that's obviously a powerful comment. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. I live in China 3 years and a half in Zhuhai. I was professor in Sun Yat-sen University in front of Hong Kong. When I came back to Argentina and to Latin America, I was really surprised about the influence of China in the time I was in China. And of course, commerce, investment, and related to our countries in Latin America is really important right now, and all the opinions and all the media information. Of course, we have tweet diplomacy here too, related to many countries, to United States Embassy, to Chinese Embassy, but we have more equilibrate, we think, opinions related to China. And of course, this is related that because we have not good economies, we have economic crisis all the times, and investment of China are really important in strategically sectors like energy, for example, or logistics, and this is going to have a really important impact. So we don't have public opinions or media opinions against China, or a lot of fake news against China like in the past. We think that we have more equilibrium related to that. It's more stable, the opinions. And this is because the influence of China in our economy is really important.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that answer. Do we have any more questions? If not, I'll have a little final question, or we'll actually finish. So my final question, in a sense, it was to sort of resituate this. I mean, we're talking about China's Twitter diplomacy, But I think, as Mariano was suggesting there a bit, I mean, of course, China is not the only country to exercise Twitter diplomacy. And I suppose it's always the case of, it's always, I mean, I suppose it would be extremely difficult, but it would be impossible really in your project to sort of compare China's Twitter diplomacy against another country's Twitter diplomacy, or it would be a really big research grant with lots and lots of research assistants. So I don't really think you'd be able to do it easily, at least. But I mean, I suppose in a way, we do come back to this idea that, I mean, clearly, in a sense, you're talking about China's Twitter diplomacy, and of course, it's a very particular type of Twitter diplomacy. But how could you know, if someone were to argue it's a sort of extremely sophisticated version of an N1 analysis, you know, what you might you say to that? I mean, how can you sort of compare China's Twitter diplomacy with another Twitter diplomacy, if you like? I mean, it's a question for the form, really, but I mean, in a way, we always have to think of these questions.
Well, maybe I can just quickly, as I've shown on my first slides, the literature. The literature is very rich in studying the Twitter diplomacy of Obama administration, of Turkey, of Japan, the United States beyond Obama administration, the Trump administration. So we have in the literature all these wonderful studies throughout the 2010s. And then we have another set of literature of people looking at China's public diplomacy. And I think any student and any research students or any other scholars can look at all this literature and look at the conclusion of what they have said about other countries' diplomacy and what we have to say on China's Twitter diplomacy.
And I think that you'll be inspiring a whole new generation of students. And so on that case, and on that point, let me bring this session to an end and thank all the panel, all of the speakers and all the members in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much.